generally think of Lincoln as one of our most important constitutional scholars. He made very sophisticated legal and political arguments, understandable in plain language, both for the people at the time and for us today. But constitutional explanations mean very little if you can't back them up with strong congressional legislation. And as I'm sure you know, making constitutional arguments and actually getting bills passed through Congress are very different things. True in the 19th century as it is today. Now, by the end of the Civil War, Lincoln had become an expert at both the argument and the means of passage. And the most important example of this, of course, was in his promotion of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, formally outlawing slavery. And you probably have all seen the movie Lincoln, where they capture very well all of the backroom dealing behind the 13th Amendment. Lincoln and his Secretary of State, William Henry Seward, put the full force of the presidency behind it. It wasn't just constitutional argument. They had to work behind the scenes to influence members of Congress to vote for this critical piece of legislation. The skill involved in backroom negotiation was actually something that Lincoln had learned quite a bit earlier during his very short time in Congress back in the late 1840s. And that's what I want to talk with you a little bit about, Lincoln's experience in Washington and how Congress worked. So let me start by telling you a little bit about how Lincoln came to Washington and the circumstances of the country at that time. As a young man, Lincoln had been tremendously ambitious. His law partner, William Herndon, later remarked that Lincoln's ambition was a little engine that knew no rest. After serving in a variety of Illinois offices, including 4 terms in the state legislature, Lincoln ran for Congress as a member of the Whig Party and was elected in 1846. And in those years, you were elected in 1846, but you didn't take your seat in Washington for a full year. So Lincoln comes to Washington in December 1847. In part because of his political ambitions, Lincoln hoped to be a major player in Washington. But he had made a deal with the Whig establishment in Illinois not to run again at the end of his term. And so this meant that Lincoln had only 2 sessions of Congress, the 30th Congress, to make his national mark. There did seem to be ample opportunity to make this mark in 1847 and 1848 on 2 major issues. These issues were the Mexican War and the presidential election of 1848. And so Lincoln's experience with these 2 issues gives a good overview of how he learned the business of Washington politics, how Congress actually worked during this period. So let's start with the first way that Lincoln hoped to make his mark, and this was on the issue of the Mexican War. In the few months before Lincoln came to Washington, the war was becoming increasingly unpopular, and particularly with Northerners. It was not very popular in Illinois. The origins and conduct of the war were largely the responsibility of Lincoln's Democratic rivals. James K. Polk, the president, had entered the conflict in large part to try to acquire territory that we now know as California. Whigs charged that Polk had provoked the war with Mexico. His idea was to get the land, and the Mexican government was actually defending itself against American aggression. And they might not have been far off in this charge because the circumstances behind the war were a little bit fishy. Polk had argued that the Mexicans had crossed the American border and fired on American troops. But the actual line separating the newly acquired territory of Texas and the nation of Mexico was in dispute. And so Polk's assertions about how the war had started, that Mexicans had fired on Americans on American soil, were definitely up for debate. Lincoln hoped to be a critical leader in the charge against what he called Polk's unconstitutional and needless war. And so a mere 2 weeks after Lincoln arrived in Washington, he got up in the House of Representatives and delivered a speech that historians, well, that his contemporaries, but historians in particular, later called the Spot Resolutions. In the Spot Resolutions, Lincoln asked for proof that the Mexican government had started the conflict, proof that Mexican armies had crossed into American territory. He demanded that Polk demonstrate to Congress whether the particular spot of soil on which the blood of our citizens was so shed was or was not our own soil. He followed up these demands a few days later with a second speech, reiterating his points and insisting that if Polk did not respond, the president would demonstrate that he is deeply conscious of being in the wrong. Now, Lincoln's words here, while not quite as polished as his later presidential addresses, show much of the same flair that characterized Lincoln's written and spoken word, and he was very proud of these efforts. There was only one problem. No one was really listening to him. His fellow congressmen offered little or no reaction to his words, and President Polk, who kept incredibly long-winded diaries, did not mention the Spot Resolutions or even Lincoln once. So people were not really registering what Lincoln was saying. Why? Well, this has to do with the way that congressional politics operated in the mid-19th century. In that period, as perhaps now, there was a set of unwritten rules for how Congress operated. It was critical to learn these rules if you wanted to become a successful and influential member of Congress. And these rules were not necessarily hard to learn, but a new member was not likely to know them in the first 2 weeks of a new session, particularly when one of the first unwritten rules was, as a freshman member of Congress, you should be seen and not heard. There were a lot of reasons for this, right? The line to speak on the floor of the House was pretty long, typically, and the older and more experienced members of Congress did not really appreciate an overly ambitious young Lincoln getting his turn first. Second, there was also an elaborate set of written rules that governed who could speak and when, and how to be part of the conversation. Generally, young members just didn't know these rules until well into the session. In the letters that they wrote home to their wives, congressmen described this annoyance with overly ambitious freshman members pretty routinely. One of Lincoln's contemporaries explained, "Nothing makes a man so unpopular or so soon destroys his influence as talking." Making too early speeches really crossed the line. As another contemporary explained, one speech was enough to introduce yourself. More than that, and you got the reputation of being officious and would not be listened to. Of course, listening was a problem to begin with. This was another unwritten rule of the House that Lincoln was going to have to learn. Most speeches were given to half-empty chambers, and even those present for a maiden speech were typically not paying any attention at all to what was being said. Congressmen in the antebellum era did not really think about the hall of the House of Representatives as where congressional business got done. And as a result, they often didn't show up for the daily sessions, or they came to the Capitol, but they spent most of their time in other rooms, such as the Supreme Court or the Senate. Those who did come to the hall of the House of Representatives were often occupied by other things. They would talk to their neighbors, or if they were tired or maybe drunk, they would take naps on the sofas lining the walls of the House. Congress also operated without the modern frills of congressional offices in the 21st century. They didn't have staffs that could write to their districts back home, let alone computers and emails. And so they spent a lot of time answering letters to their wives and to constituents and to friends from the House of Representatives itself, from their desks. As a result, they were not listening to what was going on. And so most of the real politicking on behalf of members of Congress happened outside the Capitol. Congressmen wrote bills, argued about political ideas, and bargained for support in a wide-ranging number of places across Washington, places like hotel bars, gambling dens, boarding houses, and private clubs. They talked real politics in the private spaces of Washington, not in the public arena of the House of Representatives. So it was actually no surprise at all that Lincoln's speeches didn't register on anyone's radar in 1847 or 1848. Historians since then have made a lot of Lincoln's spot resolutions. They've talked about all of his great reasoning, but we only have this with the benefit of hindsight, right? At the time, people just didn't pay much attention. So Lincoln didn't do so well in his first stab at becoming an important Washington player, but Lincoln was a quick learner, and it didn't take him long to figure out that making speeches was not going to get him anywhere. He needed to get involved in the backroom Washington politics if he wanted to make a difference. And this is where he put his energy on the second major issue of the 30th Congress, the election of 1848. In the 1840s and 1850s, like today, nominating conventions for each party met in major U.S. cities in the months leading up to November. But unlike today, politicians typically went to nominating conventions without an agreed-upon choice. There always seemed to be 4 or 5 possibilities, and occasionally a real surprise candidate would emerge over the course of the convention voting. Much of the preparation for conventions happened in Washington in the months before conventions met. In Washington itself, the equivalent of party leaders and campaign managers emerged, and congressmen in particular engaged in full-fledged politicking for their favorite candidates. The first session of the 30th Congress that Lincoln came to stretched from December 1847 to August 1848, giving congressmen ample time to advocate for their nominees during the lead-up to the nominating conventions that summer. And Lincoln wanted to be involved with this. He had good reasons for this. He had good reasons for wanting a say in the 1848 Whig nomination, which was scheduled to take place in Philadelphia in June. His reasons included the fact that Democrats had long controlled his state of Illinois. Lincoln was even the only Whig in the Illinois delegation of the 30th Congress, and so it was in his best interest and in the interest of the party to select a good nominee who could help grow the Whig influence at home. And for Lincoln, that meant that the best choice was a hero from the Mexican War, a man by the name of Zachary Taylor. Now, Taylor was a political newbie. He had not served in political office and had spent most of his time engaged in conflicts with Native Americans on the frontier. His chief rival for the Whig nomination in 1848 was Henry Clay, a longtime politician who had served as Speaker of the House and Secretary of State and was widely considered one of the most important founders of the Whig Party. Clay was a natural selection for the Whigs, but he was really unpopular in Illinois. And although Lincoln had long been a fan of Clay, an admirer of Clay, he thought Taylor was a better choice for the party. Advocating for Taylor on the floor of the House was not going to be the way that Lincoln would make his mark. Instead, he was going to advocate for Taylor as a part of a group called the Young Indian Club. Now, this club was a sort of congressional debating society that Lincoln joined fairly early in his time in Washington. This club started with 7 people, 2 Northerners and 5 Southerners, Lincoln being one of the Northerners. One of the Southerners, interestingly enough, was Alexander Stephens, future Confederate vice president and a member from Georgia, and he became Lincoln's chief friend. By January 1848, this group, the Young Indian Club, was meeting regularly at Mrs. Shelden's boarding house on Pennsylvania Avenue, where 4 of the members lived. And they debated all kinds of issues, but particularly things like state sovereignty and Whig politics. And fairly quickly, after the Young Indian Club formed, the men in the group united on the possibility of electing Zachary Taylor, nominating him for president as a Whig. Each of the young Indians had different reasons for supporting Taylor's candidacy, but they knew that if they advocated on his behalf together, in the backroom circumstances of Washington, instead of just making speeches on the floor of the House, they were going to have a much better chance of getting him the nomination. So the young Indians spent the first 5 months of the new year rounding up supporters for Taylor and preparing for the convention. Lincoln was very involved in this. He bragged to a friend in March that the group had already committed between 40 and 45 Whig congressmen to Taylor. By late May, they had secured several more through backroom negotiation. In June, 3 of the young Indians took their places at the Whig convention in Philadelphia as formal delegates, and others came up to try to help make sure that Zachary Taylor would win the nomination. Lincoln was one of these people. On June 7, 1848, the Whig convention at Philadelphia nominated Zachary Taylor for president. 5 months later, he would become the second and last Whig to win the highest office. The young Indians had succeeded in getting their man, and they had not done so by making speeches. They had gotten involved in the backroom negotiations, the dirty business of backroom politics. So the first session of the 30th Congress, I think, really provided critical lessons for Lincoln about how politics worked in Washington. Public leadership was important, but it wasn't going to get a lot of things done. Backroom dealing and persuasion with a like-minded group of partisans could make you pretty powerful. These were lessons that were going to remain important more than 15 years later as Lincoln and his Secretary of State, William Henry Seward, coaxed and cajoled various members of Congress into supporting an amendment to end slavery. Lincoln, of course, as president, made public speeches and statements asking Congress to pass the amendment, but he knew he needed the votes. Through weeks of backroom pressure and lobbying, Lincoln finally secured the 2/3 majority necessary to win support in the House. On January 31st, 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, which formally declared that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist in the United States. This amendment, one of the most important in our constitutional history, was really in part related to Lincoln's experience in Washington. Thank you very much.
Freedom 101 is made possible by generous support from the University of Oklahoma Alumni Association. Freedom 101 is a program of the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage at the University of Oklahoma. For more videos and podcasts, visit freedom.ou.edu.